I am Paul Cartledge. I am the president currently of this august society, Society for the Promotion of Hellenic Studies, and you are tuned in to this year's summer lecture, the privilege, pleasure, and honor of which I have the pleasure to introduce you to now. James Diggle, Professor James Diggle, is a legend in his lifetime. He is Cambridge's and possibly the world's foremost Hellenist. I have to declare a personal interest. I've known him many, many years. We've been colleagues since 1979. But I got to know him especially well when I was secretary to the Faculty Board of Classics in Cambridge, and James was president. And I had read The Prince before occupying that role, but it suddenly all seemed to spring to life to me when I watched and sat next to, very often, James in operation as chair of the Faculty Board of Classics. He is FBA, Fellow of the British Academy, for many, many years. He is Emeritus Cambridge Professor of Greek, well, I suppose I have to add, and Latin. He is, or was, our public orator and has published a selection of his utterly brilliant speeches. He is a long-standing fellow of Queen's College, though he actually started out at John's. He's a Jonian in our parlance. And there is now a James Diggle Prize at Queen's. There is a James Diggle Fund in Classics, to which all, of course, Queen's and other Classics graduates are warmly invited to contribute. There are far too many of his publications for me to even begin to list, so I'll be very, very selective. First of all, he is the editor of the two Euripides volumes in the OCT, Oxford Classical Texts series, both of which are now online in the modern manner. But my favorite, this is very selective and idiosyncratic perhaps, my favorite of all his publications is his edition of Theophrastus's Characters. And James is, if nothing else, a character. And I once asked him, what would you have wished to be had you not become a foremost leading academic? And he said, an actor. And my immediate thought was, but James, you are an actor as well as an academic. So you've managed to combine both. And on that note, I hand over to you, James, to deliver this year's SPHS summer lecture on the, well, new with a small n, Greek lexicon. Over to you.
You are very kind, Paul, as always. The story of the lexicon begins with John Chadwick. As a young man, he served for 6 years on the editorial staff of the Oxford Latin Dictionary. In 1952, just after he'd been appointed to a lectureship at Cambridge, he heard a talk on the radio by Michael Ventris, who tentatively announced that he'd deciphered Linear B, and that he believed that the script was an early form of Greek. Chadwick was the first to write to him and offer congratulations. He also offered his help, describing himself modestly as a mere philologist. Ventris invited him to collaborate on the publication of the decipherment. After Ventris's early death, Chadwick became and remained the leading figure in Mycenaean studies. Today, the names of Ventris and Chadwick are linked in the minds of classical scholars by the same inseparable bonds which link the names of Liddell and Scott. Towards the end of his life, he returned to lexicography. He was appointed to a committee overseeing the publication of a revised supplement to Liddell and Scott's lexicon. This prompted him to write his final work, Lexicographica Graeca, published in 1996, in which he demonstrated some of the inadequacies in the content and method of Liddell and Scott, by examining around 80 words and showing how the job could have been done so much better. So what is Liddell and Scott? The original lexicon was published in 1843. It has been continuously revised. The last edition, the 9th, was published in sections between 1925 and 1940, revised and augmented throughout, as the title page has it, by Henry Stuart Jones. Hence the acronym by which the lexicon is generally known, LSJ. A supplement was published in 1968 and the revised supplement in 1996. Meanwhile, in 1889, an abridged version was published, the one in the middle. And this is to play an important part in our story. Known as the Intermediate Lexicon, this was based on the 7th edition of Liddell and Scott, published 7 years earlier in 1882. This Intermediate Lexicon has been continuously in print for 140 years and has never been revised. And yet it remains the lexicon most commonly used by students in English schools and universities. There is also still in print a smaller abridged edition on the right, based on an even earlier edition of Liddell and Scott. So here they are, shoulder to shoulder, the family of 3, Little Liddell, Middle Liddell, and Father Liddell, sometimes known as Great Scott. In 1997, John Chadwick proposed to the Faculty Board of Classics in Cambridge that it should oversee a project to revise the Intermediate Lexicon. The Faculty Board agreed, and in the following year, formally established the Greek Lexicon Project, with financial support from John Chadwick and other sources. Anne Thompson, who'd been a pupil of his and had later been assistant to the editor of the revised supplement, was appointed as the lexicon's first editor. Pat Easterling was appointed to chair a management committee, and I was appointed to chair an advisory committee. It was hoped that the project might be completed within 5 years. This, remember, was 1998. So why has a project designed to be completed by one person in 5 years taken 23 years? For some of its duration occupied 5 full-time editors, necessitated the raising of huge financial support, and for 15 years or more took over my life. Before I answer that question, let's consider how you might go about producing a new dictionary. Not just a dictionary of Greek, but of any language. There are 2 ways. The most economical way, plan A, is to base yourself on what has gone before and then correct and supplement it. That was the method of Liddell and Scott, and then of Liddell Scott Jones. The first edition of 1843 was based on Franz Passau's Handwörterbuch der Griechischen Sprache of 1831, which itself drew on Johann Schneider's Griechisch-Deutsches Wörterbuch of 1805 to 1819. And here we see one of the weaknesses of this kind of dictionary making, and hence a weakness of LSJ. If you base yourself on your predecessors, the structure of an article may remain unchanged. Old material may be taken on trust and not re-examined. Supplementary material is apt to be added piecemeal. Translations sometimes live on in English that has become antiquated. The other way, plan B, is to start again from scratch. First, gather your own material by reading the texts afresh. Enter the material on slips of paper and then put the slips in order. This was the method of Dr. Johnson, whose dictionary of the English language was the product of his own unaided reading, though he needed 6 helpers to copy the quotations he had marked in his books. And it took him 8 years. This was the method of the Oxford Latin Dictionary, which employed in all 17 editors over a period of 35 years. You see John Chadwick's name, 3rd from the foot of the left-hand column. Above all, this was the method of the Oxford English Dictionary, which employed an army of volunteer readers and took 70 years. Before I get on to more serious matters, I can't resist a diverting anecdote. Do you know how the Oxford English Dictionary got off the ground? In 1859, the Philological Society of London put out an advertisement calling for volunteers to cooperate in a project for reading the whole of English literature. The readers were to note down usages of lexicographical interest in the works assigned to them, and they were to send them on slips of paper to the editor, James Murray. And here is James Murray in his scriptorium with some of his assistants. There was one particular reader, a Dr. William Chester Minor, who sent in his slips with regularity over some 20 years, and covered a vast amount of literature, and made contributions of the highest quality and perceptiveness. Eventually, James Murray decided that he'd like to make the acquaintance of his unknown correspondent, and thank him personally for his efforts. But Dr. Minor, whenever Murray invited him to Oxford, politely offered his regrets and said that he was unable to travel. So one day in 1896, Murray took the train from Oxford to the address in the village of Crowthorne in Berkshire, from which Dr. Minor had addressed his contributions. He came to a huge mansion, and the servant who opened the door ushered him into an imposing study, where stood a solemn gentleman. Murray bowed gravely and said, "I am honored to meet you, sir, and to thank you for the many years of service which you have rendered to the English dictionary." The man replied, "I fear, sir, you are mistaken. The gentleman whom you wish to meet is a resident here, and has been for more than 20 years. I am the superintendent of this institution, the Broadmoor Asylum for the criminally insane. And so they went to Dr. Minor's book-lined cell, and the sad history of the lexicographer came out. He was an American who'd served as a surgeon in the Civil War. He'd been traumatized by the work which he'd been obliged to perform on the casualties in that conflict. After the war, he emigrated to England. And one dark night, in the streets of Victorian London, he killed a man, for reasons which never became clear. You'll find his name given a place of honor in the page of acknowledgements prefixed to the Oxford English Dictionary, and you can read his whole story in a wonderful book by Simon Winchester, The Surgeon of Crowthorne. So, to return to my question, why have we taken 23 years? Because as soon as work began, it became clear that the plan as originally conceived was unworkable. The Intermediate Lexicon of 1889 was even less satisfactory than we and John Chadwick had imagined. It could not be revised. Plan A. It would have to be completely rewritten. Plan B. Following John Chadwick's sudden death in 1998, the faculty board agreed that we should compile a new and independent lexicon. This would still be of intermediate size and designed primarily to meet the needs of modern students, but it would also be designed to be of interest to scholars, insofar as it would be based upon a fresh reading of the Greek texts, and on principles differing from those of LSJ. It was originally planned as a single volume of 1,200 pages, but it has finally grown to over 1,500 and is published in 2 volumes. The Intermediate Lexicon has 900 pages, so we're larger by about 70%. Happily, we didn't need to employ an army of volunteer readers because we could call on help from other sources, and those sources are no less American than Dr. Minor. First, we were fortunate in engaging the support of the Perseus Project, based in Tufts University in Massachusetts. Using the resources of the Perseus Digital Library, an American colleague helped us to create an electronic database containing the corpus of texts to be covered, with each word in its context and matched with an accompanying translation. In time, this resource was supplemented and then superseded by another, the Thesaurus Linguae Graecae at Irvine. For the first time in the history of lexicography, it was possible to find every word at the press of a computer key and to examine that word in its context. For composing entries in the lexicon, we developed a new technology of our own, a tagging or coding system in XML, extensible markup language. This is a very complex system, using over 100 different tags, and is tailor-made to suit the distinctive style of the lexicon's entries. It's largely the brainchild of one of our own number, Bruce Fraser. So, what is distinctive about our lexicon? I've tabulated its distinctive features under 8 headings. I'll first explain these headings and then illustrate them from entries in the lexicon. First, author coverage. The coverage of the lexicon extends from Homer to the early 2nd century AD, ending with Plutarch's Lives. We include all of the major authors who fall within that period, and most of the minor ones, and many new texts unknown to LSJ, such as Sappho and Menander, texts which have turned up on papyri in recent years. In all, we feature about 37,000 Greek words, used by about 90 different authors. Organization of entries. We don't organize entries according to chronological or grammatical criteria, as LSJ normally does. In other words, we don't automatically start with Homer, or with the active voice before getting to the middle or passive, or put constructions with the accusative before constructions with the genitive or dative. Instead, we organize entries according to meaning. We aim to show the developing senses of words and their relationships between those senses. So we begin with the root sense of a word, which may well appear not in the earliest author who uses that word, but in a later author. And then, in numbered sections, we trace its different applications in the different contexts in which it appears. We'll see examples of this in a moment. Introductory summaries. For some longer entries, especially verbs, we give an introductory summary to show the reasoning behind the grouping or sequence of the numbered sections. Again, we'll see examples of this shortly. Definitional phrases. Where necessary, we give explanatory definitional phrases in addition to translations. What, you may ask, is the difference between a definition and a translation? A definition describes the general sense of a word, and it may be applicable to that word in a variety of contexts. A translation reflects the meaning of the word in a specific context. On the page, we make a visual distinction between these two by giving the definition in Roman font, the translation in bold. Again, we shall see this soon. Author labels. We don't give precise references to specific passages, such as Euripides Medea 243, but use author abbreviations alone. You see them in the left-hand column of the author list, and we use some collective labels for groups of authors. For example, Homer, abbreviated as Home, covers both Iliad and Odyssey. Attic orators, abbreviated, refers to 3 or more orators. Lyric, abbreviated, to 3 or more lyric poets. Tragedy, abbreviated to trage, refers to all 3 of ASE, that is, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. And for the most part, we don't give Greek quotations. Now, the omission of specific references and the omission of Greek quotations may seem surprising, and it is perhaps our most striking change from LSJ. So let me explain our reasons. If you cite a single specific passage to illustrate a word or usage, You run the risk, by being so selective, of giving a partial or distorted picture. And if you quote such a passage without translating it, as LSJ often does, you're doing no favors to the learner. So whenever we do give a requotation, we always translate it. Just consider what we gain by omitting specific references and quotations. We gain a great deal of additional space for material of a more helpful kind. We can refer to a much wider range of passages, and we can give more detail about the contexts. This is what is referred to by the heading added contextual material. The penultimate heading is cross-references. We make liberal use of cross-references. Here is part of a page consisting of little else. I've highlighted the two examples of the form esan. A student who encounters this form needs to be guided to both of the verbs to which it belongs. And finally, we use contemporary English. We don't call blauter, like the Intermediate Lexicon, a kind of slipper worn by fops. Nor do we translate krokotos as a saffron-colored robe worn by gay women. And what of the words which brought a blush to Victorian cheeks? Liddell and Scott could have claimed, in the words of Edward Gibbon, "My English is chaste, and all licentious passages are left in the obscurity of a learned language. We spare no blushes." We don't translate the verb hesdo as to ease oneself, do one's need. We define it as to defecate and translate it as to shit. Nor do we explain bineo as inire, coire, of illicit intercourse, but simply translated by the F word. Nor do we translate lycasdo as to wench, but define it as perform fellatio and translate it by an expression which is so crude that I'd better leave it on the printed page. I'll illustrate the features which I've been describing by reference to three entries. For an adjective, a noun, and a verb, I've chosen three very common words familiar to everyone. First, the adjective kalos. If someone asks you to say what it means in one English word, you will probably say beautiful. Fair enough. But you need to consider what kinds of noun the adjective is applied to, and whether it is necessary to introduce other translations that suit them better. And once you look at this word in its contexts, you'll see how many different shades of meaning it can have. Before we get to the meanings, our article starts by giving a small amount of information relating to dialect, spelling, and vowel length. The ordinary feminine termination, for example, in the Attic and Ionic dialects, is eta, air. But in other dialects, it is a long alpha, ah. It has a different accent in the Aeolic dialect. And in verse, from Homer onwards, its first vowel, alpha, may be scanned as long, Carlos. Then we give the comparative and superlative forms. The comparative normally has a short iota, Carleon. But in Attic, the iota is long, Carleon. And so we come to the meanings. We begin with a definition in Roman font. Beautiful in appearance. This is the root sense of the adjective, the sense from which all other senses are derived. The adjective is applied in this sense to humans, deities, animals, their bodies. 3 translation words are offered in bold font, not just beautiful, but also handsome and good-looking. This use is so common that a bare Homer plus is all we need. Then in section 2, we bring in a different type of noun, places and features of the natural world. The original definition is still applicable, but not all of the original translations will suit, so we bring in a different one, fair. Then in section 3, we move from natural things to created things. In section 4, we move away from beauty of appearance to beauty of sound. Then we move away from beauty altogether to a more general sense, for which the rather elaborate explanatory definition reads, as a term of general commendation of things or circumstances. Good. In terms of quality, practical usefulness, or capacity to satisfy or give pleasure. And we offer 3 translations, good, excellent, fine. And here for the first time, we introduce a new author label as an ironical use appears from the tragic poets onwards. Then in section 6, some applications of this sense in specific circumstances. Then in 7 to 8, some uses of the neuter in verbal or prepositional phrases. And you'll notice that our translations are now in italic. This is because we're translating a phrase, not a single word. Then in 9, we move to something decidedly new, when the adjective acquires a moral connotation in application to things said or done. And in 10, we have a specific development of this use, when it is paired with agathos, good, but not before Herodotus, to describe a particular type of man, occasionally woman, who combines various types of excellence, fine and good, upstanding, decent. And this pairing becomes so much a part of ordinary usage that it can even be applied to places or manufactured items, an island, an oil flask. Now let's take a noun, hair, hand. Most exciting of nouns, you may think. How can we possibly make it interesting? We've tried. The first section deals with the physical hand. It illustrates some of the commonly recurring circumstances in which the hand is used. In a couple of instances, it is used metonymically. That is, it stands for the action in which it is used. Because it is clasped in making a pledge to clasp hands, it can be used to mean pledge. because it is raised in voting, to raise the hand, it can be used to mean vote. Then in section 2, we find that it often means more than hand. It can also refer to the forearm as well as the hand, so it can actually mean arm. Notice that hand and forearm, as the definition, is in Roman font, while the translation arm is in bold. It is often modified, section 3, by the adjective acra, literally at the tip, and then it becomes either the tip of the arm, that is the hand or fingers, or the tip of the hand, that is the fingertips. Notice again the use of italics because we're translating a phrase. Sometimes, section 4, it describes an object resembling or functioning as a hand or arm, such as a cavalryman's gauntlet or a grapnel on a warship. And the lyric poet Timotheus uses it figuratively, that is, metaphorically, in calling a ship's oars its arms. Then, section 5, hand is used to denote a side of the body, often with the adjectives right and left. For illustration of this, we refer the reader to the appropriate sections of the articles on those two adjectives, aristeros and dexios. Hand may also be used, section 6, as an indication of nearness in prepositional phrases meaning close at hand. Also, section 7, to signify engagement in an activity, to have in hand. Or, section 9, as the instrument of possession or control, to fall into someone's hands. Or of violence, section 10, to lay hands on. Then, developing from the hand as a symbol of strength in section 12, we find it in a concrete sense in 13, of a body of people, especially soldiers, possessing a collective strength, that is a band of men or a military force. And because the hand is also an agent of manufacture, section 16, it is used concretely, just once, of a manufactured item, a piece of handiwork. And finally, because we write with our hand, it is used in another concrete sense of a person's handwriting, again, just once, in the Orata Hyperides. My third example is the verb echo, one of the commonest Greek verbs, whose basic senses are have and hold. Our entry for this verb runs to 55 sections. Oh dear, you'll be thinking, we're not going to trawl through 55 different meanings, are we? No, we're not. I simply want to make one general point. If a verb has as many applications as this, you need to provide the reader with signposts to show how you've organized the material, to show that you've organized the numbered sections in groups, and to show that these groups follow logically one from the other. So here is our initial summary of the groups. We move from the physical, sections 1 to 3, hold by physical contact, to the less physical, section 4, hold in one's possession, then to the non-physical, beginning in section 15, as for example, have thoughts or have consequences. And this development is marked by a shift of sense from hold to have. There's also a distinct group from section 29 onwards, in which the senses hold back, constrain, restrain. And finally, there's a group of intransitive uses and a group of uses in the middle voice. This introductory summary makes it easier for the reader to navigate through what is a very long and complex article. Let's put one page of our article side by side with the corresponding page of LSJ. Here is LSJ on the right, 2 columns of densely packed material with little to guide you through it. The labyrinth of Minos was more easily penetrable than many an article of LSJ. Samuel Johnson described the lexicographer as a harmless drudge. Hausmann mocked the compilers of the Thesaurus Linguae Latinae as the chain gangs working at the dictionary in the Ergastulum at Munich. And a certain Herodicus of Babylon in the 2nd century BC coined a memorable couplet, "Gone your bamboukes, bumblers in corners, monosyllaboi, masters of the monosyllable, hoisimemele, whose interest is in tos hin kais fuin, kaitomin, editonin, spin versus spuin, and min versus lin." I and my colleagues have bumbled in corners. And oh, how we have drudged. But we hope that we have created something which will be of lasting service to students and scholars, and which will not disappoint those many individuals and institutions who, by their generosity, have sustained us through these long years. Among those to whom we are indebted is the Hellenic Society. To mark our gratitude, we have made for you a special presentation copy bound in leather, which I have pleasure in unveiling now. My thanks to the Society, and once again, dear Paul, you.
Dear James, I accept your gift on behalf of the Society, and I thank you most sincerely and warmly for not only undertaking a criminally insane undertaking, but for bringing it to completion. You were our main man, 23 years of which, as you say, 15, where your primary preoccupation is surely more than Herculean. It is absolutely adamantine and in general admirable. And I'm in awe of what you and your collaborators have achieved. Thank you so much for both that and for the wonderfully witty, typically amusing as well as instructive talk, which you were asked to give at very short notice. And you, as they say in America, stepped up to the plate most magnificently, and thank you so much. Now, I may be wrong. I've been keeping an eye on the Q&A box, and it seems to be magnificently empty. So you're just going to have to field a couple of questions from me. And then if anybody feels the urge within the next 10 minutes or so, we've got about 10 minutes to put a question to James, please feel free to do so. So I'm first of all going to ask you what is in principle impossible, but I hope you'll have a stab at it. What do you think John Chadwick, in some way the honorand or the only begetter of this enterprise, what would he be most either pleased by or most surprised by 23 years down the line?
I think that he would be most pleased to see that we have all learned lessons from him. The way in which he went about lexicography is shown in his Lexicographica Graeca. That book was prompted by his dissatisfaction with LSJ and its methodology. He demonstrated in that book how it should be done better, how it could be done better. And Anne Thompson, his pupil, first embarked on the task of doing it his way, and we all learned a lot from her and from John Chadwick's method as exemplified by his book. I suspect that he might have been amazed, awestruck, perhaps horrified that we had taken 23 years to do it.
Thank you. Then I have one other, and I've been reading recently Kenneth Dover's, rereading his marginal comment. And of course, Kenneth went to the same rather good school that John Chadwick went to, and I don't think that's quite irrelevant. But at any rate, my question is this. Dover rather dismissed the notion that ancient Greek was in any way superior to any other ancient or modern language. Whereas others sometimes think the shades of meaning, the extraordinary range that one single word can cover, might mark ancient Greek out as peculiarly semantically rich. And I'm just going to give you one example. They happen to be on facing pages of volume 1 of the Greek lexicon. And so on one side, you've got ep ex erchome. On the other side, you have ep erchome. They overlap somewhat in meaning, and there's one rather amusing meaning under ep erchome, which is number 9, and it's when someone moves on to a second wife. This is for Boris Johnson, obviously, though in his case it's the third wife. Do you have a sense that ancient Greek can be unusually, if not uniquely, semantically rich?
Oh, yes, it certainly can. And that's what we've tried to bring out. We give far, far more subdivisions of meaning than LSJ does. And we devoted a great deal of attention to trying to bring out precisely the nuances of a word in the context in which it appears. And you use as an example a couple of compounds, a compound and a double compound, perhaps it was. Well, this is just one example of how a slight tweak in the formation of a word can significantly alter its sense. And I can't think of any other language in which you get that to the same extent.
Thank you. That's my own sense, but then I'm relatively very limited in the number of other languages I know. So we have 3 now questions, James, for you. In fact, we now have 4, and I'll go through them in order of which they came in. First, from Catherine Harlow. Please tell us about the typography. How did you choose it? Was it a difficult decision?
We got a great deal of help from CUP, who brought in a special expert in typography who did design the Greek font for us, and we use several different fonts. I illustrated just, I spoke of the difference between Roman and bold, but you've also seen the italic as well. We took a lot of trouble to ensure that we use the right font for the right type of material. And it was achieved, the final result, by experimentation over several years, but with a great deal of valuable input from CUP.
Thanks. Then there's a source question from Simon Corcoran. Did you use any epigraphic sources? And if so, were there any particular problems posed by the fact that very often inscriptions in their extant condition are lacunose?
No, we don't cover epigraphical material, just as we don't cover documentary papyri. For that, you have to go to LSJ, which it was never our intention to try to supersede. You can't supersede it. Our intention was to cover the texts, the literary texts only, which students are likely to read. But in fact, we cover far more than students are likely to read.
Then there is a technical, communication question from Rosa Anduja. Do you have any plans to make the lexicon available electronically, either as an ebook or via an app?
Yes, it will be made available quite soon as an ebook by CUP, and the Perseus people will also be putting it online. This was an agreement which we reached with them right at the beginning when they gave us so much help in developing a database using their material. There will be some restrictions on its accessibility on the Perseus network. You won't be able to download the whole of it, for example. I think that you will have to do it bit by bit. You'll be given access to individual words. We hope that eventually CUP may be able to produce its own online version, but to produce a version that will allow you to do the kinds of thing that you can do with the TLG, that is, search different types of things by dialing in what you're looking for. This is a very expensive thing to produce, and at the moment there aren't any plans for it, but we hope that eventually such a thing will prove to be feasible for the press.
Then we have one final one. It's a two-parter from an anonymous attendee. So she or he asks, first of all, does the lexicon ever refer to other languages, such as Latin?
No, we don't. Partly in the interest of brevity, partly because it's of limited usefulness, I think. The big LSJ has a lot of comparative material in it. It's had constantly to be revised in the light of developments in philological knowledge. The amount of Latin that's used in glosses in LSJ, interestingly, has decreased over the years. It was used quite a lot in the earliest edition, but in the latest, the 9th, it's been very radically cut down. So we don't use any other language but English.
Then this same anonymous attendee asks you, why is it a lexicon and not a dictionary?
Oh, I think we're just reflecting the use of the term by LSJ.
Not because
you could say that lexicon is a Greek word, dictionary is not.
that's what I thought you might be going to say, but yes, the two answers coalesce and reinforce. So unless, James, there's anything else that you would like to add, I think this is the time for me to wrap up. Is there anything that you would like to make as a final au revoir?
Well, as you'll know, the lexicon sells at an unbelievably bargain price, £64.95. The first printing has now been completely sold out, and it is in the process of being reprinted. It sold out in 5 weeks.
Wow, well done you. The other thing is to congratulate you on the publicity. I know you wickedly chose certain words of a blue note nature, but you managed to get a great deal of, as they say, media coverage. So that won't have hurt your sales. Thank you very much for your talk, for all your labors, for your geniality and genius. And I have sadly to let you go, but it's been an absolute pleasure being with you this past hour plus. And thank all the attendees as well. Absolutely marvelous.